So as I was introduced, my name's Daniel Scroy. I'm a professor of economics. I'm also the coordinator of the department's experimental and behavioral economics research group, and I run a lot of the behavioral science in the university. So what I'm going to talk about, therefore, might surprise you. It might not be exactly what you expect economics to be about. This is a talk I sometimes give, particularly to people at school, etc., and the idea is to try and point out that economists are not as boring as you think. Okay, it's a long time since I think terms like the dismal science can realistically have been used about economics. We're not very dismal. And particularly today, because I'm going to be talking about literally the opposite of dismal, I'm going to be talking about happiness. So what I want to do is split my talk into 3 bits. The middle bit is the important bit, but the first bit is really about motivation. It's to try and convince you that this is interesting enough that you'll stay awake for the rest. And the end is going to be even crazier than the middle. So if you think the middle's weird, wait till you get to the end. I want to emphasize a couple of things. First, one is, why am I even giving you a random talk about a random topic in economics? It's because Warwick University is a research-led teaching university. That means that the people who teach you also do research. That's true of all of our academics, and there are many of them. And because we're such a large department and we all do research, many of the things that you'll be taught by someone who is very good. They're an expert. They may be on the absolute frontier of the research that's going on in the world. We think that's really important, the fact that you get taught by people who don't just know economics, but they're there pushing the boundaries forward. And you get an opportunity to do that at Warwick. And as I'm sure you've heard, in the 3rd year, you get to start doing your own research. So I think it's an important aspect of what Warwick is all about. So I'm going to talk about measuring national well-being, as said, in unusual ways. And first of all, I want to motivate this by convincing you that we need a measure of national happiness. So why does happiness matter? Why is it important? It's sort of obvious, I think. Everyone realizes happiness is important. Everybody wants to be happy, clearly. But let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to the likes of Confucius, Aristotle, people who claimed that some definition of happiness was possibly even the meaning of life. It's the best you can get out of existence is to be as happy as you possibly can. Definitions varied. Happiness doesn't have to be hedonistic. It doesn't have to be partying all day. It could be fulfillment, having a life in which you feel you've accomplished certain things, but that somehow gives you some pleasure. The fact that you've accomplished things, you've done things, could possibly be the meaning of life. It's also the hidden objective behind all of economics. And most of you in the audience will have done some economics before. So terms like public economics, development economics, industrial economics, these might be meaningful. But all of them have, behind the back of what you might think the real objectives are, happiness. So if you think about development economics, it's about trying to remove misery from some of the poorest parts of the world. Removing misery, that's literally getting rid of unhappiness or boosting happiness. It's the same thing. It's all about trying to make people who are in impoverished and miserable surroundings, trying to make them feel better about life, trying to boost their utility, happiness, well-being, whatever you want to call it. Similarly, industrial economics, if you think about monopolists, what do? Well, they exploit consumers by charging unreasonable prices. And what do those unreasonable prices do to consumers? They make them unhappy. So it's all about happiness. I could keep going. Public economics, tax and spend. I mean, why are we doing that? We're doing it to try and raise the well-being of society. We're trying to boost welfare, well-being, happiness. It's all the same thing. Happiness is fundamentally important, and it's probably the meaning behind what we do as economists. Probably the meaning behind what we would do if we were physicists or chemists. It's essentially all the same thing. We're trying to make life better for those people out there in the real world. It's also a very good way of measuring success. I'm going to talk soon about the differences between income and happiness. Some people might consider income or your salary to be the best measure of success. And if that was true, we would all work 24 hours a day until we probably drop dead. I mean, we would try and maximize that income number. People would never work part-time. They would never go on holiday. These things would be crazy because they would be worse for you. But people do things like go on holiday. They do take part-time jobs. They do take jobs where the salary is a little lower because it makes them happier. It's probably the best measure of success that we have. And for economists, it matters almost by definition because, again, if you've done some economics, you know economics is about maximizing utility. What is utility? One simple-minded definition, something you could use to a non-economist to try and explain what it is. It's not exactly the same, but you could say it's a bit like happiness. It's not the same as income or money. It's something a bit broader than that. If that's all true, why do we focus so much on income? And again, for those of you who've done enough economics, why do we focus on the budget constraint rather than the utility function? Why are we so obsessed with working out what the maximum is that we can spend in order to obtain something, rather than the something that we want to obtain? That seems to be a little bit more important. I think the answer is that it's easier to measure income than it is to measure happiness. And GDP, our standard measure of national income, gross domestic product, has been collected consistently since the 1930s. We have almost 100 years of data to use. Economic historians have pushed that back. For the whole world, we have about 200 years worth of data. And for some countries like the UK, we have centuries and centuries of data. That's enough for us to really understand how national income moves through time, what changes it, how it interacts with other important things like unemployment and inflation. We understand that very well. The problem is we don't have that quantity of uncontroversial data that we can use to understand how national mood, happiness, or well-being changes over time. We just don't have so much data, which means we don't understand it as well. So national happiness data for the UK and for a select group of countries has existed since about the 1970s. So we have maybe 50 years for some countries in the world. For everywhere in the world, we have more like 10 years worth of data. The World Happiness Report first came into existence in 2012. That's 10 years worth of data for most of the world. There's also an issue of controversy. When we're dealing with national income, we just have literally the raw data. We have the numbers right there. This is the number, this was how much income the economy, this is how much income was generated in the economy, here it is. When it comes to happiness, we just ask people. They might be lying. They might be trying to make us feel good about ourselves by maybe exaggerating how happy they are. They might be going in the other direction. Different cultures might behave differently when we ask them how happy are you? In one country, it might be considered rude to say too happy. In another country, it might be considered rude to say too sad. So what does this even mean? It's not an incentivized measure. We can't be sure that it even is meaningful. And we have very little of it in any case. So that suggests to me that the reason why the focus is so much on income is because we understand it and we have enough information to make reasonable judgments. That's a problem, though, because income is not good enough. If you think about the various things that boost income in the economy, some of them look like they would actually generate negative well-being. Simon Kuznets, an early developer of GDP, pointed out that countries, generally speaking, boost their GDP just before and in the early stages of wars. So as you're militarizing, your GDP goes up. So if we think income equals well-being, it's a good measure of how successful an economy is, then economies in the middle of wars are looking pretty successful. That can't be right. Similarly, what about the environment? We've got some horrible pictures there of the BP Deep Horizons oil spill, one of the worst individual environmental calamities of recent years. It was so substantial that the cleanup operation actually increased US GDP. There were so many companies involved in trying to fix this problem. GDP went up. So again, now we've got our best bet on how to boost well-being, if you think it's measured only by GDP, is to start a war and have lots of oil spills. I mean, that can't be right? That can't be right. And there's so much more. There's so much more to well-being than income. I won't have to convince you that mental and physical health matter, that some people want leisure rather than income. The fact that we even think about a trade-off between leisure and income suggests that income isn't so all-important as we might think. So we need measures of well-being. We know that in the UK. We've been collecting those measures, and we've been trying to use them to make sensible judgments in government. But the amount of information we have is minimal. It's based on annually collecting data. So in 100 years, we'll have some serious amount of data, but right now we do not. I'm also going to emphasize here that I'm not suggesting we throw away income data, we forget about economic growth. It is still the budget constraint, which means it's one half of the problem. We can't ignore it. We might want to boost happiness, but we might not have any money to spend boosting it. So it's still important to try and focus on income, but we shouldn't do it and completely ignore the flip side. So we shouldn't keep boosting forward the budget constraint, even if it's damaging utility overall. And that's why we have to start thinking about all these other things, which means we need a measure of happiness so we can decide what's more important to the population right now. Pushing on with economic growth, focusing on health, thinking about the environment, trying to avoid conflict. I mean, these are all possible things that could push forward well-being, and we can only determine which one makes sense if we have a sensible measure of well-being. So let's look at a way to try and bolster the data that we've got. One thing I did with some colleagues, a psychologist, a neuroscientist and a fellow economist, was team up to try and use language to boost the amount of available data that we've got. So as I've said, we've got maybe 50 years of data in the UK, maybe 10 years of data in many other countries. How can we get hundreds of years of data so that we've got something that matches the amount of data we've got in income? One possibility is to use language. So psychologists know full well that mood or happiness can be inferred from the words that people use. If you walk in here grumbling about death, murder, and disease, you're probably not very happy. Whereas if you come in here and start talking about vacations and happiness, that tells me that you're probably quite happy. So I don't need to rush up to someone who is talking about nothing but miserable subjects to determine whether they're unhappy or not. I can see that. When you get home and you hear your parents talking, typically you don't have to rush up with a survey question to determine what their mood is. You can work it out. And in fact, this fits in better with the way economists do things. We generally don't like to ask people. We like to infer based on what we call revealed preference. If you do something, it means you probably wanted to do it. If I see you buying apples rather than pears and they cost the same, I infer from that that you prefer apples to pears. I don't rush up to every consumer and ask, did you really want to buy that apple? Do you really like apples more than pears? I work it out based on behavior. Similarly, I can work out your mood based on your behavior. I don't necessarily need survey data. So all we need to do is find some data, some way of determining what words were used in the past, and then maybe we can work out how happy people were in the past. So what we did was we looked at books and newspapers, we looked at billions of words stretching back hundreds of years. We built a machine learning algorithm, an AI if you like, and we got that to work out for us what the average level of happiness was going back a couple of hundred years. There's a simple way of thinking about that where we don't need advanced algorithms, which is just to say we used a weighted average. So if some words are happy words, some words are sad words, if there are a lot more happy words than sad words in one year, that's a happy year. And we just use a simple weighted average. We're going to have to do a bit more than that to fix a few problems, and for that we need serious computational power. So I'm going to explain how that works. So the first thing we need is what we call big data. We need a serious amount of data. There are ways of getting that. There are even free ways that you can muck about with when you get back home. So at some point, I guess you get sent these slides. Is that right, Bazena? So you can use this slide to have a look at what we call Google Ngrams, and then you can type some random words in, and it will tell you, spreading back perhaps several hundred years, what percentage of the English language was encapsulated by that word. So you can type your name in or something and see how commonly it appears in published material going back hundreds of years. You can type in any words you like. You'll see the most common word in the English language going back 500 words is the. There you go, great. Anyway, that was probably not very revealing about happiness, but it nevertheless gives you an idea. And you can look at words like, for example, let's imagine the English language only contained two words, murder and holiday. Holiday is pretty happy, murder is not. So if people wandered around in one year saying holiday, 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 that's probably a good year. A year in which they wander around going murder, 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 not such a good year. And by looking at how it changes, we can work out whether a year is good or not. So that's pretty much a summary. But let me give you the next thing we need, which is we need numbers. It's all very well being able to say that words can reveal mood, but what numbers do they generate? Because we want a rolling average. We want to say happiness has gone up by 5%. We don't want to say it's gone up by 17,000 uses of the word murder. That doesn't, or down by 17,000 uses of the word murder. So we've got numbers that come to us from a concept in psychology known as text valence. This is where loads of people were asked to look at loads of words and give a feel for what those words generated, the sort of sentiment they generated. And in the future, this will probably come through things like scans, where we're actually looking at what neurons pop in the brain when certain words are issued. So examples would be something like happiness, which gets you 8.53 out of 9. Whereas, for example, murder gets you 1.48 out of 9, and where 1 is the lowest number. So that's pretty miserable. Strangely, not everyone's calling that a 1. Some slightly worrying individuals roaming around, but nevertheless, most people think murder is a very miserable concept, whereas happiness is a very happy concept. And you can see some other examples on the slide. Lots of things there, including words like lovemaking, which probably we shouldn't go into during this lecture. Right, and then, so what we do is, we have all these words, we convert them into numbers, and we form a weighted average. Seems pretty straightforward. What we wanted to do was allow ourselves to generate an index which we could use in many countries. So we chose 1,000 words which have these sorts of scores available in many languages, like English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, for example. And then we worked out the weighted average for each year for each country, and we rolled it back to about 1800. That's when basically literacy levels were high in the UK and in most of the Western world. It's also when the novel and newspapers became forms of entertainment, essentially. Instead of, for example, dry texts about the law, religion, etc., or basically manuals telling you how to do things, they became novels, sources of entertainment. So we think that from about 1800 onwards, language starts to reflect emotion a little bit more than, say, in 1600, when it probably reflected what sort of religious beliefs were prominent, for instance. So on the basis of that, we created our moving average. We also wanted to what's called validate it, which is to say check whether it seems reasonable for that period of time when we do have survey data. We want to make sure it correlates with what people actually say in the real world to make sure that it looks reasonable. So that's essentially what we did. This is the correlation from 1970 to 2009 between what people say if they're asked a survey question and the words that they read or use if they're reading or using newspapers or books. And you can see a pretty good correlation, and there's something there called a p-value, which if you don't understand now, you will by the end of your degree wherever you go to economics, which essentially tells you that the probability that this set of data is, the probability that this reasonable correlation is just random is very, very small. You're going to see that randomness 1 in 100 times, or actually much less than 1 in 100 times. So it's very, very likely that this correlation is meaningful. It's not just spurious or random. We know that words with high valence, happy words, occur significantly more at times of higher life satisfaction. And that's why we get that correlation. When people seem happy, they use happier words. That's not a trivial result, by the way, because it's quite possible that when you're sad, you might think that you'd be tempted to go and read something happy or use happy words to try and cheer yourself up. Turns out that's not what humans do. When they're sad, they wallow in it. When they're happy, they want to make themselves even happier. It's just the way we are. That's sort of useful for our research, maybe not so useful for human well-being as a whole. We also, and this is why we needed serious computational power and why we teamed up with someone, one of our co-authors at the Alan Turing Institute in London, where we needed a bank of supercomputers working for days, weeks at a time to process this. The reason why we needed that much computational power was we wanted our index to be what's called stable. We wanted the words that we use to have the same meaning stretching back 200 years. Otherwise, our valence measures, saying this is 8.57 out of 9, would have been meaningless. Let me give you an example. If you take the word dig, it's the one I always use, it's my favorite one because I can easily motivate why it changes, but if you take the word dig, for many, many decades, centuries, that meant taking a shovel, there's some soil, I move the shovel into the soil, move it away. So if you look at the word dig in the English use, you see words like soil, dirt, shovel, spade, all round it. Now, if that's what we saw for 200 years, that would be what we call a stable word, and we would want to use it. Unfortunately, you get to the 1970s, and suddenly people are saying things like, I dig you, man, and that does not mean I'm going to attack you with a spade. It means I like you, I understand you, I've got sympathetic feelings towards you. That is completely different from digging dirt. And that means the word dig is not stable. Now, I can tell you that dig isn't stable, but how can I check authoritatively, if I want to look at billions of words and I want to pick 1,000 stable words or 500 stable words, how can I do that authoritatively? Well, I get a bank of supercomputers to look at billions of words and look at the words that are around those words and make sure that it doesn't matter where I'm looking at any point in history, that word is surrounded by the same sorts of words. And it's also iterative. The words that are surrounding those words need to be stable as well. What if 2 words move at the same time? So we also have to look around those words, and quickly you see how this becomes very complex and why we need such computational power. So we need big data, billions of observations, seriously powerful computers, and that's why this research is reasonably topical, and it wasn't done 10 years ago when we did not have access to that sort of technology. Okay, quickly I'll show you the results. I'm really taking liberties with time here. I'm going to remind myself of when I actually have to stop. When am I supposed to stop, Bazena? Okay, that's fine. So here's a couple of examples of different indices that we produced. One is based on newspapers, one is based on books. They're a little different. You'd expect that. Newspapers are more immediate. Books are not. So newspapers tend to react quickly, sometimes overreact quickly. Books tend to be a bit more considered when it comes to reflecting the news. But nevertheless, they're very highly correlated. Now, let me focus in on a period where there's some hope that people in the audience would know something or other about what's going on. And this is the period immediately after the period between World War II and, say, the financial crisis of 2008. Now, if we look at that, what we see is, and I have to emphasize this, the most important thing for us is not the levels, but actually the growth rates or the rate of change. This is what you might think of as economic growth. You can think of this as well-being growth. So when you see a sharp decline, that is cataclysmic. That is something like a recession, but in happiness. And you can see some happiness recessions during world wars, the Great Depression, things like this occurring in the first half of the 20th century, which was full of these really crazy collapses that just go like that. In the post-World War II period, there weren't any dramatic collapses, but there was a slow decline. And I'll give you an example of where this slow decline took place. 1957, Harold Macmillan, the then British Prime Minister, said, "We never had it so good." That was literally the peak of this. What he should have said is, "And we won't have it so good again for quite some time." Of course, that's bad English. He wouldn't have said that. But nevertheless, happiness slowly declined through the 70s and then hit what's known now as the winter of discontent, which was some sort of minimal level of happiness in the post-war era. The winter of discontent literally means the winter of unhappiness. And there it is on our metric. It's pretty miserable. There was a slow improvement, and in particular, there was quite a big improvement in the sort of noughties, but we can see there the period, I guess the sort of new labourish period, things shot up quite well. And then there's a dip back when we hit the financial crisis. We haven't renewed this index for a while. We're sort of thinking we'll wait until things calm down and then we'll see what happened, because it takes weeks and weeks to run this thing. But it never calms down. At the moment, it's just craziness all the time. So one of these days we'll update this, but it's quite a vigorous process. So let me summarize, and then I'll tell you a little bit about something a little more recent that we're doing in the same area. So we can say a few things about happiness using our index, which we could not say before. We've never had a measure of happiness that goes back more than 50 years ever before. So now we can do things which we could never do before. There's something famous in economics called the Easterlin paradox. A famous economist noted something remarkable, which is that there are many poor countries in the world, and when people in those poor countries are asked, "How happy are you?" they report similar numbers to people in very well-off countries. That's called the Easterlin paradox. How can it be that countries that are relatively poor seem to be full of people who are just as happy as countries that are relatively rich? It's a bit worrying given how much energy we've devoted to trying to get rich if it's not actually improved anything. And that's why it's called the Easterlin paradox. It's not really a paradox. It is to economists, because we tend to like to think that income should boost happiness. But that result was based on cross-country comparisons, and that has all the problems I mentioned before, cultural problems. In some countries, people might well say they're happy when they're not necessarily happy. Even worse, we have what's called habituation in happiness. Human beings are amazingly good at getting to about 5, 6, or 7 out of, say, 9 in happiness levels, irrespective of what you do to them. Literally irrespective of what you do to them. You can put them in prisons, you can remove limbs, you can do all sorts of horrific things. They will be terribly unhappy. A couple of years later, they'll be reporting numbers between about 5 and 7. It's just ridiculous how quickly people habituate if they're humans. We were almost created to be able to live in all sorts of extreme environments under really weird conditions and still be reasonably happy. That habituation problem makes it very difficult to us to judge whether happiness is really, really being measured properly, or whether people just say similar numbers all the time. The way to control for things like habituation and culture is to look at the same country over a long period of time and look at rates of change rather than comparing 200 years apart. If we do that, we can finally answer the Easterlin paradox, and what we see is that income does matter, it does boost happiness, but not by much. It takes remarkable amounts of extra income to make a nation a little bit happier. Just to make that really obvious, if you are given £1 million, you'll get very happy very quickly. But what if you're given £1 million and all your friends are given £2 million? Are you going to get much happier? This is the problem with the nation level stuff is you can make one person happier easily, but making a lot of people happier is difficult. You can't give everybody more than everybody else. It's literally impossible. And that's one of the things people like, is to think they're getting more than everybody else. So it turns out that income does boost happiness, but very, very slowly. And things like health avoiding wars, avoiding conflict, they seem like much more straightforward ways to boost national levels of happiness, especially for wealthy countries where there's what we call marginal diminishing returns to income. Essentially, people are already reasonably well off. Okay, very quickly, just 5 minutes or so, I'm going to summarize some new work that I've been doing, relatively new, about trying to fix one of the big problems with using text. The problem with using text is you need ridiculously powerful computers and you need billions of observations. So is there a way of simplifying things so that we can measure happiness using language, but without billions of observations and ridiculously powerful computers? The answer that we stumbled upon was to use audio data. So people have said music is a universal language, a language of the emotions, etc. That's very prosaic, that sounds very nice, but is it really true? Is it really a language? Well, that's what we set about to look at. Can we use sound data in the same way that we used language data? So if people are listening to pleasant sounds, does that tell us that they're happy? If they're listening to unpleasant sounds, does that tell us they're unhappy? And if so, can we build a national measure of well-being by looking at the #1 top-selling chart hit in a country every year? That sounds preposterous, but it turns out that we can, and actually it's even better than using words. So our methods, I'll brush over this a bit because I probably am about to run out of time. Our methods are very simple. We look at the #1 chart hit in, say, the UK every year, going back to the 1970s. We train up an AI, and this really is an AI, and we train it up to be able to detect whether that music is particularly happy or not. How do we do that? Well, we have a bunch of sounds that we know are happy sounds and sad sounds, and we train an AI. If you don't know how to train an AI, don't worry. The way to think about it is, imagine you've just got a child, and you subject that child to lots of noises, and you keep saying, that's a nice noise, that's a nasty noise, that's a nice noise, that's a nasty noise. The child would gradually work out what features the noises have that make them nice or nasty, and it will build a sort of subconscious algorithm in its head to tell you whether sound is good or not. And eventually, the child will learn how to detect nice music and nasty music. AIs do that, but they do it very well, very quickly. And what the AI generated was a 191 variable equation using all sorts of features of sound that allowed it to detect whether sound was good, was happy sound or sad sound. Then we asked it to use that algorithm, which it created itself after we trained it, on the #1 top-selling hit in the UK going back 50 years, and create a simple index of happiness based on that. So that's what we did. So I've zipped through this a little bit. And then the final thing we did was we compared this index that we'd created using pop songs with our text measure and with GDP. And we used these last 50 years because we have this survey data that tells us how happy people were. And we wanted to see which of these three was the best at predicting happiness. Was it our pop song measure, our crazy word measure that uses billions of words and ridiculous numbers of supercomputers, or was it the old GDP measure that people have thought was great for years? It turns out the best measure is actually music. This is something you certainly won't understand yet, but in years to come, when you've mastered regression analysis, you'll recognize this as a horse race. Essentially, we pit these three models, the music valence index, the text valence index, and GDP against each other, and we see which of them correlates best with life satisfaction. And the 3 stars essentially tells us that the music valence index does a very good job at doing this. Why is that? Why does it hands down win? Very simple. People listen to music usually to derive pleasure from that. So it is an incredibly pure measure of emotional reward. Text has lots of uses. You might just be telling somebody that you want to meet them in 10 minutes' time. Hard to derive a lot of emotional content from that. That's why we needed billions of observations. But music is so pure that you don't need much. And it's also really, really good at telling you national levels of mood. Why? Well, because the #1 best-selling song is literally the most popular song in the entire country. And that tells you what the average person in the entire country wants to listen to. If we use the top 100, which we tried, it gets worse. If we use the top 10, it gets worse. The more songs we use, the worse it gets, because we're starting to look at subgroups in society, people with different tastes from the average. The further we move from the average person, the worse it gets. So it turns out that music is an incredibly good way at detecting how happy a nation is. And you can use this. When you find out what the top hit was of this year, just have a listen to it. If it makes you feel depressed, it was not a good year, let me tell you that. So some general conclusions. So economics is not a narrow discipline. Now, you can't possibly have sat in the audience of this lecture and you can't leave and say, economists, they just care about money and interest rates, and unemployment and inflation. That's all they care about. You can't do that. You've just heard what I've had to say. There was very little mention of things like that. It's a broad discipline. We care about a great deal. A lot more of our work than perhaps used to be the case involves multidisciplinary collaboration. The music stuff was with computer scientists, for example, and experts in AI. It's about welfare and well-being, not just money and profits. We use big data, and you'll learn how to process large data sets if you do a degree in economics. And it's also changing very, very fast. The stuff I'm doing now, I did not do when I started my academic life as an economist. This was not the sort of thing I was doing decades ago. I'm that old. I was doing very different things. I was a theorist. I spent most of my time looking at game theory, which you may or may not know what that is, but it's worlds different from this. People still do that, and I still do that occasionally. But what the wonderful thing about economics is I cannot predict what will be cutting edge even in 5 years' time, let alone 10 years. Trust me, physics, they'll still be searching for the theory of everything. What we'll be doing, I have no idea. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much.